What I want to do first thing today is to revisit the storytelling models, patterns in some of the films we've seen so that we can fully grasp the originality of Goodfellas. Because in a sense, without this being primary, we've seen regular life, family life, mixed with criminal life, criminal activities in a lot of the films. As a secondary theme in films such as Little Caesar and Scarface, and then much more prominently in The Godfather and in Goodfellas. However, it's clear that the interactions between the private family life and the criminal lives of the protagonists are very different, going from The Godfather to Goodfellas. And so I'll put on the board a series of diagrams so that we can have a visual model to follow, and then we'll watch the execution of this model. We'll try to identify this pattern in a series of key scenes from the central part of Goodfellas. I also prepared just 3 quotes from the book, and if there is time I'll go over them today, otherwise I'll do it on Thursday. And before we leave, I also want to revisit with you the deadlines, talk about the oral presentation, etc. I hope I can read my notes because I didn't bring my reading glasses. Otherwise I can just take off my glasses like old men do. So, when you have any kind of story, and this is very true in films, because films tend to present a simplified version of a story, not as complex, not as intricate as a book or a novella. Often you have a baseline and a highlight. And characters, with their actions, with the events in their lives, follow a trajectory that goes from base to high and back in different ways depending on the genre. So, the baseline of the story would be the level where you find characters waking up in the morning, brushing their teeth, as you find at the beginning of Bumblebee, for example. If you've seen that film, the only Transformer movie that is worth seeing, in my opinion, as an adult. All the others are enjoyable at some level. Or characters going to work, being in the subway, doing regular stuff, right? That anyone going to see that movie can identify with. The high line would be either some level of drama, a dramatic event impacting on the lives of the characters, bringing that tension into their lives, or it could be some heightened emotional status. The character is in love, is falling in love and experiencing the rapture of passion, for example. Or the character is some kind of military hero or some kind of Mission Impossible hero on a task that requires their full commitment. One way or the other, usually any story, including and especially stories from films, take off after showing the premise. So the premise in some films could be just the character doing regular stuff. Waking up, going to school, waking up, going to work, But at some point, for the story to become a story worth connecting with, at some point you have a trajectory that goes towards the high line. And then, of course, all stories have to have some kind of narrative patterns. So, for example, if this is a love story, the high might be, the crescendo might be the infatuation, the falling in love. The high could be when the couple gets together, when they become a couple, when they start a relationship, and then usually in the usual three-part story used in love stories in Hollywood especially, you have some kind of either gradual or sudden distancing, right? A loss of the Edenic state, the state of grace in this relationship, to the point where the character might end up being much more depressed, even worse than they were at the beginning, and then they get back together, right? And the movie will end somewhere in here with the prospect that, of course, they should get back to the high of their first encounter, but it's best not shown how their life will develop. It's usually they reconnect, they get married, end of story, happily thereafter is just assumed. In other cases, if this were some kind of thriller, then instead of a clear line, you would have a series of waves, ups and downs, right? Moments, valleys, where the characters can enjoy some initial result of their actions, some partial victories, but with new moments of tensions, new challenges, until the very end, and usually heroes a la Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible. I'm using that because it's so typical, not because it's the greatest character you can find, but usually in those stories, you imagine the character continuing on like that, existing like this between highs and lows, between the baseline of regular life, which they never really touch, and the highs of danger and risk. Okay? So, feel free to interrupt me, either to ask questions or to propose examples of this. So what happens when you find films like those in the gangster genre that we have found? If we were to schematize, for example, the early films from the 1930s, Little Caesar and Scarface are the best examples, then in those films we find characters that were never shown in the film at their baseline, right? You don't even imagine Rico brushing his teeth, doing trivial things, right? It's out of question. You only see Rico fully dressed as a criminal, planning or involved directly in criminal activities. So if we, between the baseline and the high line, if we have to place Rico, then it would be at some middle level, and of course Rico's trajectory is up from there, not going back towards regular life, which is not even an option for him, but going up. Now, in order to make this visual and easy enough to grasp during the hour and a half that you have in a film, usually you offer a counterexample in the film. That's why next to Rico you find Joe, his friend, because this way you see better the trajectory of Rico, because you see that Joe is instead on a trajectory that brings him down in terms of dreams and aspiration towards regular life. So Rico's dream is to become a couple, to become a boss, right? Even though Rico is fully cognizant of the fact that that would be a constant state of warfare, and he welcomes that, right? is so thriving with his existence, shoot first and then talk later, that he's fine with that. Whereas Joe would like to extricate himself, become a professional dancer, have a family with Olga. And again, since films need to make every concept visible and concrete material, then the baseline in traditional films is represented by women. Men are connected with big dreams, big projects, violence, tension, heroism, and women are connected with marriage, maternity, stability, because family, maternity need stability. So Olga is the factor that is pulling Joe towards a regular life, and eventually you see Joe's trajectory now. It's difficult to represent it clearly, but Joe's trajectory is towards a baseline or some version of it. Of course, we should say, perhaps we should stop in here, because their life will not be basic. There will be stars, celebrities in the show business, right? They have at the end this big board that celebrates their show, and therefore they've made it, right? So it's not really a baseline. It's an enhanced version of that. The same is true in the case of Scarface, where you find Tony, you find his friend Gino, and of course Tony, like Rico, is moving ahead towards more tension, more drama, more warfare, so that he can conquer the north side of Chicago, defeat the police to the very end. He believes that. And Gino has Cesca, right, Tony's sister, pulling him towards the baseline of some version of a regular life. And of course this trajectory gets interrupted dramatically because he is killed by Tony. Let me see if I'm forgetting anything, but everything is there for these films. So, I want to be able to capture this on video. So if you take the same kind of schema for the Godfather, what's new about it? Again, if we have to place the characters, for example, Vito Corleone at the beginning of the film, within this diagram, his life is not very close to the baseline. However, at the same time, there is an intentional effort by Vito to avoid drama. That's very clear, right? What's new about The Godfather in terms of the development of storytelling is that in all of these films, the tension towards drama or towards a return to the baseline are represented by different characters, right? You have Rico moving towards drama, more drama. You have Tony moving towards more drama, and you have Joe and Gino shifting away from drama and try to approach a regular life, right? In the scene before Gino is killed, he and Cesca are talking about the possibility of living together, eventually marrying, etc. What's interesting about Vito is that Vito is moving in both directions. So moving up and down, never really being a mono-directional character, adding drama. No, it's trying to compress, stay away from the drama, even though, of course, he's a violent mobster, so there will be orders to kill this and that. But at the same time, Vito himself, not another character, also represents the desire, the movement towards the baselines of life values. And in this case, that's represented by his family in general. It is represented by members of the community, because in The Godfather Part 1, as opposed to all the other examples, we find more representatives from the community who benefit from the protection of Vito but are not themselves criminals. The baker, for example, and his son-in-law Enzo. And in particular, what's interesting, what makes this a great narrative, is that at the beginning of the film, Michael plays, in terms of story patterns, the same role that Olga and Cesca were playing in these films. That is to say, Vito has imagined a different life for Michael as a college graduate, as a war hero, therefore somebody who can stay outside of a life of drama and remain as close to the baseline as possible. So what's interesting is that, as I said, you see these two movements that and a kind of oscillation. So Vito's arc or trajectory as a character goes up and down towards high drama of crime and back to the baseline of time with the family. And we could add here, for example, the scene with his grandson in the orchard, in the garden, when Vito will die, right? Vito dies in a garden playing with his grandson as a regular Godfather. That's what makes The Godfather different, because you cannot imagine Rico or Tony playing the part of the Godfather, playing with a nephew or a grandson, right? Because their trajectory is just drama and more drama. They're a train that is going straight to its destination. Its destination is distraction or self-destruction. Destruction of others on their path, and then ultimately self-destruction. In the case of Vito, Vito is trying to be both. What's nice about this film is that, this being the premise, then you find another character, Michael, that is trust towards drama. And it seems that there is no other way around. That unlike his father, there is little chance for Michael to go back towards the baseline of life. And however, he's kind of the family martyr, somebody who would like not to use violence, but is trusted upon this world of violence, and he has to do it to protect his father, his own family, etc. And then later on, the struggle for Michael is to try to parallel the existence of Vito. So the issue, moving from part 1 to part 2, and then through the entire part 2 of The Godfather, is, can Michael be like Vito and moving in the direction of drama whenever the circumstances dictate so, but then being able to pull back, right? Pull back is one of the famous phrases for Godfather Part 3. And in this case, The Godfather doesn't do anything particularly original, right? Because the baseline, once again, is represented not by a plurality of groups and characters, but mostly by him, right? So here too you find a woman to represent the values of the baseline of life, maternity, marriage, and the happiness within that insular unit, social unit that the family is. However, Michael will never be able to replicate the balance that Vito found in between the highs and the lows, and the attempts to go back to the baseline of life, the attempts will be foiled, will fail, and he'll be left only with this, right? This section of the story. We find Michael, who is virtually barred from any kind of happiness, even when he's not involved in crime. He'll be reminiscing about the impossibility of getting back his family, right? And that's how you find Michael at the end of part 2. And that's more or less where you find Michael in The Godfather part 3. So what makes Wise Guys different? And Harry himself has a wife and a family. But what is immediately apparent is that Karen is not existing in the story at the level of the baseline, right? Do you remember how they meet? So at the beginning of The Godfather, we find Kay already engaged in a long-term relationship with Michael, right? And we know she's an independent woman, etc. How is Karen pulled into the life of Henry? Do you remember their story, the beginning of their story? Yes.
A friend going on a date with Tom.
Yeah, they go on a double date, right? But what happens at there? What is the behavior of Henry? Is he interested in Karen?
Sort of, but not really.
Not much, right? He feels compelled to say yes, but then while he's on a double date, he has some scheme in mind. He has some criminal errand to complete, and therefore is not giving attention. We see her at the table being ignored by him, and then they have a second date, and what happens during the second date? That they have Henry and Karen, which is another double date. She stood up, right? And then what's her reaction? Not to simply forget about Henry. Yes, Raiden. Goes after him with a vengeance, right? He gets herself accompanied to the cab stand, and she makes a scene, right? Which is not even, and that's the beauty of the film, a traditional scene, scolding him, right? You piece of ass, you left me there. She's angry and playful at the same time. She's intentionally playing a game where she takes the upper level in the relationship, saying, you owe me. And he is taken by her exactly because she's so feisty. So, she's not Olga. Cheska herself was a more nuanced character because she's also quite feisty and able to fight for herself and her relationship. But certainly we don't find Karen there at the base. So Karen herself is somewhere in the middle. Now, if we think of Henry, what we saw, especially at the beginning, and emphasized a lot in the first 3 chapters of the book, is Henry likes the life of Wise Guys, but he's also a bit detached. He's an observer, he's a learner, he's kind of on the outside of the inner circle of crime. So even for Henry, if we have to place it in here, we have to place it towards the middle. And is Henry intentionally looking for more drama? Not really, right? He likes the idea of being a wise guy. He likes being around wise guys, but he's not committed. Of course, this is also a trick to make you believe he's a good guy, right? He's not rotten to the core, but he's not as committed to the criminal lifestyle as Tommy and Jimmy, right? So he's really existed in a kind of mediocre middle life. And what's different about these two characters in the film in general is that you find this kind of wavy line for the description of the narrative, with more tension, less tension, more drama, or short periods of enjoyment in their relationship or enjoyment of their wealth. But it's a constant going up and down, but within a very narrow life. That is to say, whereas, and that's the key point of my lecture today, whereas the distinction between the high line of drama and the baseline of life was very clear in here, right? And you're confronted with a choice. Those are your choice: go back to regular life or become a full-fledged criminal and fight until the end, until you win, defeat all your enemies, or until you are defeated, you are murdered. In here, regular life and criminal life are very close to one another. They overlap. So both The Godfather and Goodfellas are different from tradition because you see criminals not only doing criminal things but also being husbands, fathers, etc. However, even in The Godfather, these two are different worlds, pulling the characters in different directions, whereas in here, these two worlds merge. And this is the main quality of the film, and it's mostly well done, but on the very cutting edge of becoming a little ridiculous, right? Of turning into some kind of comedic skit in which mafia wives prepare a sandwich for their killer husbands and send them out with a kiss, right? Because this is the level, and maybe there is some intentional grotesque element, because there are elements of grotesque in Goodfellas, right? When we saw the shocking, the brutal killing of Billy Batts in the trunk, that's grotesque, right? It's not just violence. It's something that is not fully dramatic, right? The way it is lived, experienced even by the characters. There is fear, but there is also this bravado, right? And this is fully represented by the character of Tommy, who's like the Joker of the group. Somebody who can kill without remorse. Later on we'll see him shoot Spider in the foot, then kill Spider and still laugh about it, and do this laughing. So that's how violence turned into a grotesque existence. So we'll watch a series of scenes where you see normal life and criminal life overlapping, but then of course you cannot just do that as a good director in a mechanical way. And in order to add nuances to this, what I think we can spot in the style of Scorsese in the film is that even when regular life and criminal life overlapped in a way that is almost ridiculous, then there are some unsettling hues, some elements of dissonance, because you have to keep the tension in some ways, because otherwise you flatten the story. Bring it, as I said before, bring it to the level where the killer, before going out of the house, has a doting wife who says, "Have you eaten your breakfast? Have you put on a clean shirt?" Right? So there has to be some dissonant element to remind you that this is not stability, that this is not balance, that this is not tenable. And then, either today or on Thursday, we'll see how this dangerous juxtaposition of regular life and criminal life then spirals spirals out of control in the direction of trauma, right? In the second or half of the movie or the last third of the movie. Okay? So, did you follow me? Do you have any questions before we watch scenes? So the first scene we're going to watch today is a famous one. So Karen goes for a makeup session with other mob wives, right? So you have this scene crowded with wives of criminals getting together, talking about marriage, about relationship, talking about women's stuff that apparently should belong to the baseline, but it takes very little to understand that these are mob wives. And you have Karen, who's at the very beginning of her married life with Henry, playing the same role that Henry had at the beginning of the film, being the outsider in that circle. She's in that circle, but she's on the outside. And as a partial outsider, she's observing, and you'll see very clearly. Lorraine Bracco is even exaggerating the length of her neck to show that she's studying the other people, and she's learning what the dynamics are. What are the dynamics in this group? Because this is not a group of regular wives. Their husbands are not regular husbands, their sons are not regular sons, and therefore you're supposed to find elements of tension suggested not just by the narrative but by the whole scene, and I want to get your opinion on what those elements that are unsettling the narrative are, because what is the following scene, which I will not include because it's not particularly artistic. In the following scene, Karen is sitting on her bed in her nightgown, and she's worried and talking about Henry and saying, what if you go to jail? What if you're arrested? Because what she experienced was not a moment of calm. It was a domestic scene with elements of tension, and therefore her concern is, you are a criminal, and like the other criminal husbands, sooner or later you'll be killed or go to jail, to which Henry responds stupidly, just saying, oh, people who don't want to get caught are not caught, and this genius husband who ended up in jail did it because he didn't want to spend time with her wife. He'd rather be in jail, some kind of silly, unbelievable joke. Okay? So that's the first scene. It's not very long, it's only a few minutes. And tell me what visual elements, not just the words that you hear from Karen, who's the narrating voice, from the wives, but what visual elements create tension. And we can watch the end of the previous scene, right? Because that's interesting too, in terms of offering you, the viewer, all the elements, because you find after Karen and Harry got married, got all this money, they were celebrated as a new couple, you find Karen abandoned by Henry at her parents' house, and this house and this couple, her parents, represent the baseline, right? So Karen is never placed there. We don't see really her. We see her at the house when Henry comes to pick her up, but we don't really see doing basic stuff. In here you have the most basic Jewish couple with this apartment with tacky furniture from the 1960s, right? Look especially at the curtains. And you get the typical visual style that communicate the message, whoever grew up in here would like to escape this life, right? And yet she's trusted back, left there with her parents, and then we see her as an independent woman going out with her kins of sort, the wives of her husband's colleagues. Okay, so let's watch both. You have this discussion between husband and wife. So clearly, the first and the major element of dissonance in the scene with the makeup, with the wives applying makeup, of course, is the narrative itself, right? You have a group of wives, but instead of talking about furniture, the carpet, as you can imagine in other films, women doing in a domestic setting, they're talking about people going to prison, people shooting each other, even kids shooting each other, and their concerns about the potential consequences of their husband's career. What else? As I said before, putting aside this major element of the dissonance between the lines and the scene, what do you see visually that really adds tension to the scene? And I'm not talking about a lot of elements, there are a few elements. So I just want to pick your brains, or maybe you're able to see even more than I can point out. What are the elements of dissonance? Oh yes, of course, Liz, in the semi-darkness I didn't see your hand. So
in the scene of the wives talking, while they mainly focus on like whichever woman's talking, you can see another woman next to them and their reactions.
yeah, and this is something that the film does a lot. Other films do it, but in this case, in The Wise Guy, in Goodfellas, this is a pattern to extend a line from a character or from a song to the next frame where you see someone else or something else, to juxtapose the effect or to measure the effect of that line on the environment. You have that element. What else? Yes?
I think the fact that you don't really learn any of the other wives' names in that scene, and they sort of go between the dialogue very quickly, can show like from Karen's perspective how she's just hearing it all, and she's just like, oh my god, like this is crazy.
Absolutely, yeah. There is no regular pattern of socialization. It's 0 to 100.
Yeah.
0 meaning you're nobody to us, 100 meaning you're married to Henry Hill, so you're one of us. We don't even care about you. We don't care to introduce ourselves to you. You're just one of us. And this is another pattern, insiders, outsiders, where Karen will remark that they were always together, meaning they were spending time just with their inner circle, the members of the inner circle. Paulie and his family, Jimmy and his family, etc.
One other thing that they kind of showed, the fact that like when she was introduced, she was almost like separated from the other wives. Like,
She was in a corner, and in fact, all the others were packed together, right?
And then, like, she was kind of in a corner.
And we saw the same visual pattern with Henry, even during the scene of the completion of the murder of Billy Bats in the trunk. What else? What are the other elements, visual elements of tension?
Karen's kind of like her light sources coming from behind her, she'll be like growing darkness, while all the other wives have like a light on top of them, so it makes that feel like Karen is out of place and she keeps away from the movie.
And what about the representation of the other wives? What produces tension there? What makes this not a relaxing time? Ignoring the conversation, because the conversations, of course, have elements of concern. Let me see, anyone else who's not had a chance to say something? You want to try, or you have an idea? Okay, so who else? Lisa first, and then Vivica?
Maybe just the fact that the women are all actually like interacting with each other, where she's sitting and not doing anything. She's also not dressed. She doesn't have makeup on like that. She actually looks like much more regal, I feel like, than the other women. Where the other women, as they described, maybe look more cheap.
Yeah, she's not applying
she's
miles or square miles of makeup.
And a simple outfit
Right.
on, nice hair, where the other ladies, like they described, have that bright, crazy makeup and clothes and all of that part. I feel like that definitely creates tension. I don't feel that.
But exactly because she looks more elegant. And they're not. And in case the spectator missed that, the film, through the voice, points out that their dresses are cheap, that everything about the space is cheap. What element is this suggestive of? Which is also a big theme in the film. So, what makes criminal life worth it? Normally, what do you think?
Usually the benefits of
Right,
it,
well,
luxury goods.
And therefore, this conveys the theme of disappointment, right? So that there is something, yeah, you could relax because you're among friends, but first of all, I will suggest, so that we can move on to the next scene, that the pace itself adds tension. You move from one phase to another, they're all talking about different things. There is no room for a playful conversation and slow-paced conversation. There is tension produced by the pace of the lines and by the pace of the camera itself, the way the camera moves around. There are so many colors clashing, right? With the exception of Karen, who has a very nice dress and overall looks like Audrey Hepburn. The other wives have this violent colors, right? Not only on their bodies, the clothes, but also the face. For example, the blue makeup, which you've never seen other than in this film. They've chosen this intentionally, right? Because it's so excessive. What else? I had something in mind. It flew away. It's fine. Okay, so you find Karen expecting to go through a period of adjustments, and instead she's right in the middle of all this, even though she remains at the margin, but it seems like her only trajectory is to become more like them. But if she becomes more like them, what happens to her dreams? Clearly her dreams are not to become like those women. She feels different at this point. But then we'll see Karen going through a series of stages of normalization. Crime, criminal life becomes normalized. So this is the search by the FBI of Karen's and Harry's life. And this is typical, another very short scene that represents what I was trying to convey with my diagram, that regular life and criminal life get very close to one another. However, regular life is not what you would define as regular. That is to say, things that would seem unsettling to anyone else become the norm, become normal to her, but you as the spectator can see the dissonance in this. So the FBI comes to search the house, looking for evidence to incriminate Henry, and you'll see that she reacts the way a wife welcoming social acquaintances would react, welcoming the agents, acting as everything is normal, and the agents themselves go about their job in kind of a routine like. You don't see the agents pulling drawers and throwing stuff on the floor as you see in other films. It's another routine. It's routine in her life, it's routine in the agents' lives. And again, tell me what are the elements of dissonance in here, because you have to realize that this is not normal. We'll stop and watch this scene next. What are the elements of dissonance in here? Of course, the biggest one is the way she behaves, even though they're FBI agents, and also the way they behave in turn. What other elements of dissonance are that show you that this looks like normal, looks like you can find a balance, but the balance is imaginary or not believable, not real. What are the unsettling elements in this scene?
I guess sort of similar to the scene with the women, that you don't, like, you hear the FBI agents' names, you don't really see their face, there's not much conversation, and it's not very personal to them, where if FBI agents were coming to my house, I might talk to them a little bit more, you know?
Maybe, I never thought of that. Okay, but to that I would only respond that films cannot show all the trivialities of the more trivial aspects of a social transaction of this kind, because the scenes have to be brief. The same way that, of course, you must have noticed that out of 1 million phone calls in a film, only maybe 2 times you see people saying, okay, goodbye, I'll see you. It's just the last line, end of the conversation, right? Always like that. So this is how films show real life. What else?
I mean, she acts like they're not there and continues to watch TV and talks to them kind of over the shoulder.
But in order to pretend that they're not there, what is she doing?
She's distracting herself by holding her kid and watching.
Watching what, right? This is not a regular film. Even if you don't recognize it, it feels odd, right? You have a singer singing in blackface, whistling, right? And then, of course, if you go find out, this is the jazz singer, 1927, and it's a Jewish story about Jewish characters, a kid who wants to become a singer, a jazz singer, whose father is a cantor in a synagogue, and therefore you have the contrast between the roots. His father would like his son's talent to be applied to a religious career, to follow up on his steps, to remain in that context, and instead you have the kid flying out of the coop to go into the world of nightclubs and jazz singing. So, if you look deeper, it's her story, right? She didn't marry a Jewish husband. She didn't stay faithful to her origins, her family practices. But even if you don't know anything about the film, this is the oddest film you can place there. Because if you imagine that she's relaxing, if you imagine you want to have your mind taken away watching TV, even in the 1960s, is this the film you would pick? Right? No. There is an element of dissonance, which is not dramatic or tragic, more in the direction of the grotesque, again, because it really looks like a film that only in the 1920s you would have found, right? And this music, the whistling, the intensity in the eyes of the jazz singer are such that you feel a tension that you cannot identify or explain. Next scene, again, the normality, the baseline is, this is a birthday, but everyone in here belongs to this criminal circle. The men are engaged in it, the wives are supporting it, right, or accepting it. And tell me if you see any dissonant elements in here. This scene too is interesting, but birthday is closer to what we were saying, because apparently birthday would be the baseline of life. But are there dissonant elements in this brief scene that make you rethink whether or not it is possible to live a semblance of normalcy for some periods of time as a criminal or as the wife of a criminal? What are the dissonant, unsettling elements in here? Throughout the whole scene up to this point, from the moment you see the kid being taken in front of the cake to the pictures. Have you noticed anything that is a bit out of sync with the intended message? Do you want to see the scene again? Yeah? What did you notice?
I mean, she said it, but it's also, they show it that it's only each other go to the same, they all go to each other's events and they're the only people there. This is the little boy's birthday. You know, you would assume that he would have friends from school and all.
Right, so there is this element of isolation.
At the other kid's house, there would be different kids because he has different friends, whereas there's sort of purposefully making this little bubble to the point where they're like, oh yeah, this is normal. She
Yeah.
said it, this is normal.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
excited.
exactly, because it's a bubble, absolutely. Yeah. And it's the social version of a Machiavellian game played by a criminal organization. You have to restrict the context to multiply the power. Because the wider the context, and the more difficult it is to maintain control. Which is the same reason that would make you think that if, let's say, to give you a basic example, was President Kennedy killed by the CIA? Well, some say not possible, exactly because it's such a big organization and so many people would have to know that how can you control information without leaks. And it might be possible if you think that there was only a very small group of people in the know and the secret was kept among them. But going back to the picture, I'll show you the pictures again. Look at Karen's face in the pictures following the birthday. So, with the exception of perhaps one of the pictures, what kind of face does Karen have in those pictures? Perhaps someone else hasn't had a chance to talk? Is she happy in those pictures? Is she into the moment? Oh,
She's got like a straight face, I saw. Yeah, it wasn't
she's not in sync with all the others. And Henry's face too is interesting because the way Ray Liotta played the character, even especially when he's around Tommy, is forcing the character to be in sync, right? When Henry laughs at Tommy's joke, it's always it's a very forced laughter. There is an intentional effort into it. It's not natural. But especially for Karen's face, you see her either neutral when the others are happy, or even displeased, or even unhappy, feeling some kind of void or dissatisfaction. So clearly a visible element of dissonance. There is another one that is kind of hidden. What's on the boy's head? What's on the boy's cake? What's the theme of the birthday? Cowboys. He has a cowboy hat. There are cowboys and Indians on the cake. There is a stagecoach on the cake. But cowboy is a keyword that you find throughout the film. And who's the cowboy among all the characters? Tommy, especially. That is to say, the idea that these people, these criminals, are wild. And therefore, their lives and the lives of those around them are exposed to risks and dangers. So this is the hidden message, because Tommy gets killed because he's such a cowboy. And this is how all the men in general in this film behave, all the male criminals. Okay, so let's get to the point, let's move to the point where we go from the simple overlap, innocuous overlap between regular life and criminal life to a moment where things are difficult to control. And this overlap becomes completely unsettling, not partially unsettling in certain moments, but completely unsettling. And that's the killing of Billy Bad. So, just so that you understand the scene fully, this character just came back from prison. He went to jail for 6 years and is now in the pub the bar owned by Henry, to celebrate his return to freedom and to his regular life. And many of the typical elements of the film are here, even though it's a pub, very dark inside. even darker than you would expect. And you have two groups, Billy Bats and his friends celebrating on one side. On the other side, on this side, on your right, you have Jimmy, Tommy, and Henry, plus Tommy's girlfriend, a few more people. So clearly you have two groups, two tribes, two clans. On one side you have colors, the balloons, the decorations to celebrate Billy Bats. On the other side, just darkness. There'll be a confrontation that will end up with Billy's murder. And following that, so already in here you have a social event turning into a murder. But even more unsettling is the following scene where, in order to get a shovel and knife from Tommy's mother's house, they end up at dinner talking about things that are reminiscent of remind us of the situation. So it's a grotesque kind of familial dinner. Familiarity and crime are inextricable from one another, and when you realize that, then you understand how after this scene, you cannot separate regular life from criminal life. There is no baseline to go back to. Okay? And it's just about 10 minutes, we'll watch that, hear a few comments, and go. Not only you have that collision of these two levels, dinner with mother and killing a guy and burying his corpse, but the voice is telling you that this is the point of no return. That killing an official member of the mafia without permission means you can never feel safe, because his fellow accomplices will be looking for someone responsible, will be looking for you to kill you. So you know that the story are going down from here, that there is no possibility for a happy ending. Anything else you noticed? Any comments or questions about this scene? As I said, this time it's not one element that is unsettling. It's the whole scene that becomes a grotesque dinner with ketchup, sauce representing blood, with the relationship with one's mother being vilified through the context, right? It's the impossibility of normalcy. Anything else that you noticed in the scene that piqued your interest, your attention? Yes, Chris.
I mean, I think one of the great parts of the movie is the direction, how the scene transition is literally them laughing around a dinner table to the guy getting stabbed in the back of the trunk, like very gratuitously, which goes to your point that it's not that these things are even a contradiction, they like have to exist in the same, they exist in the same space at all times. It's just under the surface. Like even at the bar when the main guy insults I'm so bad with names.
Tommy. Tommy.
When he insults Tommy, it's like they pretend that it's all over, and then he makes the comment again and immediately gets violent. It's like always bubbling.
Yeah. And the wideness, the cowboy thing.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. And while the narrating voice of Henry is saying to you, this was normal in that group. At the same time, the film has removed the possibility of normal.
Yes.
Right? There is no normal in their life anymore, the same way that there existed an option for normalcy in The Godfather.
Right.
In The Godfather, a normal life was part of the dream, exiting that life and being normal. In here, it's not even an option.
Well, it's an end unto itself. Like the first thing he says in the movie is, "I always wanted to be a gangster."
I'm sorry, the first thing he says?
Is all my life I always wanted to be
Yeah.
a gangster.
But at the same time, of course, when you think of Henry Hill as a young guy, you see him smiling, right? You see this open face, and through the movie you see him more and more tense, right? up to the highest level of tension created, induced by the drugs he is consuming by the end of the film.